Okay, moving on to shading. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I have an air conditioner going on in the background. Um, so this is going to be in reference to a very specific object, a smooth, light-colored, matte um, object that doesn't have much texture to it. So you can think of an egg. I think with the warm-up assignment, I'm going to make you draw with an egg. But so it's easy to see, and not only that, but with one single direct light source. And when you have this situation going on, it's easy to see the basics of all the different shadows that appear and highlights too. Again, and this isn't how nature works, because when you go out into the world, you're going to see objects that are kind of chrome. You're going to see objects that are glass-like. You can see through them, and light bounces around in all kinds of unpredictable ways. But this is just to get us a baseline of how light affects an object, and essentially that's what we're talking about when we're talking about shading. We're talking about how does light um, affect objects. So this screen. You should maybe even take a screenshot of this screen, because all this stuff I'm going to be talking about from this point on, and I kind of expect you to know this basic vocabulary. Um, and let me go over it real quick here. So the I'll always talk about the core shadow, and some people also call it the terminator. Some people call this here the border between light and dark. I refer to it usually as the core shadow or the border between light and dark. And it's basically the edge of the separation between the shadow and the light side. Um, the highlight, which you can't really see it very well in this image, is a peculiar one because it moves around. So the one here the cast shadow. This is the one everybody knows. So that means the light source is coming from this direction. Um, Less light enters into here. Um, it's called the occlusion shadow. So the big one's the cast shadow. The darker part is the occlusion shadow. I sometimes call that the contact shadow or the crevice shadow, because the occlusion shadow is just basically the crevice where less light can get into, so it looks a little darker. And the thing about the occlusion shadow is that it's not on the object. You can see it's same thing with the cast shadow. It's not on the object. It's on the surface or behind the object here. Um, Let me see. Reflected light is the lighter side in here of the shadow side. So basically, when I think about light, light kind of just bounces around like a ping pong ball. So this ball is sitting on a table. The light comes in here, it hits the table, and it bounces up into here and lighting up the shadow side a little bit. And one general rule of thumb that you should keep in mind is that once you sort of move past the border, nothing on the shadow side should really be as light as anything on the light side. A lot of times students, when I see them, they make the reflected light just as bright as the light side over here, which should never happen, because it's everything on this side of the border between light and dark is receiving indirect light. So that reflected light is bouncing light that's hitting the table or hitting something over here and bouncing, and it's indirect. So it has to hit something, then bounce before it even gets over here. Everything over here on the light side is receiving direct light, so it's going to be always brighter than anything on the shadow side. Um, the halftone, I kind of just think of it as the gradient moving towards the center light. Which again, the center light is the plane that's most directly being hit by the direct light. And I guess technically there's no highlight in here. I guess the highlight and the center light are slightly different things, but let me go back. I have another slide that shows this a little differently. So yeah, highlight. Um, so the center light is basically the plane that's bent towards the light source the most. And you see this ball is actually kind of grayer, so you can kind of see a separation. And then the highlight is it's actually kind of different than the center light. This is sort of this the highlight has something to do more with the angle between the light source and the viewer. Um, I don't want to confuse you guys too much, but basically, um, all these shadows and highlights or shadows and light side, these all these terms are a reflection of the light source. So none of these things will move unless you move the object or the light source. But the highlight will move depending on how you move your head around. Um, it's determined by the angle of the relationship between the viewer and the light source. It's the highlight is the only kind of um, odd one of these things because it's determined by your head angle. But all the rest of them, like if you move your head around, the cast shadow is not going to move, the terminator's not going to move, the halftone's not going to move around, but the highlight will. It'll wiggle around. If you start moving your head around, it'll wiggle around a little bit. So try to have these terms memorized. In the warm-up assignment, I am going to make you do a simple object. I think it's going to be an egg. I haven't finished finalizing that yet, but I'm going to make you label all of these things. And the reason why I think, well, what's the point of this is that once you sort of have terminology um, for something, you start to see it more. The minute you kind of know what a reflected light is, the minute you know what a core shadow is, when you start looking at objects in form, all of a sudden you'll be seeing them more. And it's not just going to be, you're not just going to be, oh, that's just a random shadow, or that's just a random light effect. You're going to know like how this sort of works. It's going to be a little more easy to see once it has a name to it. And if you look over here, this is just showing you a ball under diffuse light. So there's lots of different lighting scenarios. The one we're going to be discussing mostly is just a single object under direct light. And um, the ball is just sort of hovering in space. It doesn't has no real cast shadow. So again, like I could show you many different shapes, like a cone, but like all these things are going to be in every form. So it doesn't matter what shape the form is. So it might be kind of unusual to think of all these things in terms of a square, but or a cube really. But like the there's the obvious one, the cast shadow. Um, the highlight is this thin light edge right in here. The core shadow is basically, again, what's the core shadow? It's the border between light and dark. So where's the border between light and dark? Well, it's pretty obvious. It's right here. And then the reflected light is the lighter side, that kind of where some ambient light bounces in and makes the shadow side a little lighter. So you have a little bit of reflected light right here. There's your core shadow. Um, it's hard to see. There's no. I guess there really is. There is a slight contact shadow or occlusion shadow. It's right along where the object touches the edge here. But all that stuff, again, if I were to show you a cone, all that would be there too. It's just, it's all these. It's universal. The only time it isn't universal, again, is if it's an unusual object. Again, if I were to show you like an object that was like had a bunch of like texture to it, like a bunch of hair or like you think of like a really furry dog, it would be harder to see this because, but some of these would still be there. There would still be a light side to the dog and a shadow side to the dog, and certain highlights would appear. You'd see highlights on the dog's eyes, or if it's a wet nose, you would see he would still cast a shadow. Some of these things would still be there. It'd be harder to see certain things like a highlight on the hair, but it would all this is still universal. And if this was like a glass object, like imagine this was like a glass cube, it would be harder to see this because once light goes through an object and it starts bouncing around like in a million different unusual ways, it's harder to see these things. But we're keeping it basic. So this is another thing I want to make you do for the warm up is a grayscale, and there's all kinds of strange optical illusions that happen once you start thinking about um, shifts in value. It's confusing because everything is in relationship to everything else, and that's kind of a hard thing to to get students to understand, is because they tend to think everything is separate. But like an example is if I were to show you a value, like show you a gray, and I were to tell you, is it light or dark? The answer should be, is it light and dark in relationship to what? Like there's nothing that sort of just exists on its own. Everything is going to be in relationship to something else. So um, I'm going to show you how like optical illusions sort of confuse your ability to judge a value. And then if you ever take a painting class, it gets even more confusing when you start talking about color. Um, Color shifts around depending on other colors that are next to it. But we're just talking about value. So these bars, these gray bars that you see, the vertical bars, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're all the same value, but they look different because this one looks a little darker. This one looks kind of neutral middle, and this one looks kind of light. Why? Because this one's in a relationship to a dark background, this one's in a relationship to a light background. But they're all the same value, these bars. Um, your eye sees this bright white and goes, oh wow, this thing looks dark in comparison to this bright light. And your eye sees this dark background and goes, oh well, in comparison to this dark background, this bar looks light. So then if you try to compare this one to this one, it's kind of hard for your brain to go, um, to be objective and separate it from the background. It's like it's seeing it in a relationship to the background. One way to sort of force yourself to not see this optical illusion is like, take a piece of paper or a couple pieces of paper and like cover up the background, and so you can see it, the bars in isolation. Which it might be a good trick to try when you're doing the grayscale, is to so you don't get confused by the values that are next to it. So next slide. So you can see this is just basically showing you how all the bars are the same. So this is what you're going to do. You're going to make a simple grayscale. So how many squares are here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And if you count the white, actually it would be 11. So the white is one value also. I forget what I wrote for you guys to do, if it's a 9 or 10 value scale. But anyway, so the thing that I was showing you before about how your eye tricks itself into seeing things that aren't there, there's a certain effect that's happening when you see the values like this, is that, let me point to one here. So this is one solid value. It's all the same. It's the same for all the squares. But when you look at this edge over here, this is darker, and then over here this is lighter. So you're going to get this effect happening, which is an optical illusion, where this side of the square looks darker and this side of the square looks a little lighter. But it's an optical illusion. It kind of looks like this. This is an example I show you. Kind of almost looks like it's scalloped. It reminds me of a guitar neck. I don't know if any of you guys play guitar. Like they have this type of neck where they literally like sand away the fretboard. So you can kind of see when the light comes in here, it hits this side, it makes it lighter over here, and then this side gets less light, so it looks a little darker. So it gets this kind of like, scallop look to it. Something very similar is happening to this, where it looks like it's darker here, lighter here, darker here, lighter here, darker here, lighter here. So it's an optical illusion because it's not really shifting value. It just kind of it's a trick that your brain is unable to sort of see it in isolation. But if you put a piece of paper to cover up this one and another piece of paper to cover up this one, you could see the square in isolation to know that it's one single value. So what I want you guys to do is when to make several squares. I forget again. I forget what I wrote down, if it was 9 or 10. And then when you fill it in, I don't want you doing this. I don't want you drawing lines, because this is kind of like cheating. It's like it's separating them out by isolating them with a border. If you look at this, there's no separating with line. It's just an abrupt shift in value. So be careful when you do your value scale that you don't outline it darkly like this. So that's one thing to avoid. And also, here's another thing to avoid. This is what almost all students do, is as they're doing their value scale, it has to transition. Like, this one has to clearly be different from this one. This one is clearly different from this one. And students always do this. It's like they start having two right next to each other be exactly the same, but they put a line down in between them to separate them. So it's like they're tricking themselves into thinking that these are separate because there's a line. Same thing here. This, and this are exactly the same value. There's just a line separating it. So it's a really tricky thing to do, to get a perfectly shifting value scale where it's all the same value. There's no blotches in it. There's no line that's separating it, and there's a clear, distinct step between each square. And here's another thing I don't want you guys to do, is to separate it like this, where there's a gap in between. So anyway, so those are the two things you can do for the warm-up. So once you sort of memorize all these different terms, it's for a purpose. It's for you to start analyzing form, with thinking about these terms. So when you look at something like this, it shouldn't just look like a bunch of shapes that you don't really know what to think about them. You don't want to be, most of you are going to, look at this nose and be like, that's a nose, and that's a shadow, that's an eye, that's hair, and there's a shadow, and there's light and shadow. Now you have the terminology to be like, okay, underneath the nose here, that's the cast shadow. Right in here where it gets lighter, that's the what? That's the reflected light. The edge, I lost my mouse. The edge right in here, where it looks like there's a separation right here, that's the core shadow. There's also a core shadow along here, and that lighter part right there, there's more reflected light, and the face is casting a shadow onto the neck over here. And then there's some half tone over here. There's no real highlight on this guy. I mean, maybe if you saw his eye, but if he was real, you might see a little highlight in there. But, and then, okay, let's do some more. So like the shadow that's underneath the hair, that's a cast shadow, because the hair is blocking the light, it's casting a shadow. And that little dark line in there, that's kind of reminds me of the crevice shadow, or the technical term is the occlusion shadow. So the point is for you to start analyzing these terms and see them on the object, because once you sort of know how they work, you can know how to illustrate things or draw things a little more accurately. And there's certain things that always happen, like the cast shadow will follow the form that it's casting onto. So if the forehead is curved, then the cast shadow will curve. I have a video that explains this a lot better. So let me show you some more artist renditions of shading. So in the last assignment, I had you guys use hatching, what did I say? I think I said something like hatching is like a shorthand for shadows. It's cross hatching isn't fully shading, because to me shading is a solid gradient, a solid filling in. There's no gaps of line. So hatching is sort of like the first step towards shading. Um, and also keep in mind, I think hatching is good maybe early on to sort of create notations of where shadows will go. Like if I was drawing this guy early on, I would probably do some light little hatches as a notation of like, oh, there's going to be a shadow over here that I have to eventually go back and fill in or smudge in. Um, and there's many ways of drawing, and I'm not going to tell you that there's one correct way, but one way is to start um, with outline and then fill it in. Um, Sometimes I don't do that. Sometimes I actually will start drawing shadows before I even know exactly where the outlines go. Sometimes I want to have the outlines all clearly figured out before I draw. There's many ways of approaching it, and I'm not going to give you like a step by step. This is the way it has to be done. I'm going to just show you many ways of approaching it. With this instance, it's a quince tree. It's the same artist I showed you before, a painter named a Spanish painter named Antonio Lopez Garcia. Um, he's doing this from life. He's obsessed with doing everything from life. So you can imagine going outside and having to look at a tree and it's shifting around on you. It must be like a confusion, absolute confusion of just shapes. And so he slowly kind of just figures out where the edges are, and then gradually fills it in here. I would imagine if he had more time, he would just continue in the fill in here. This is this artist's name. I should have put a note. I think it's Anne Gales, or Anne Gale, without an S or with an S. I forget. Um, Another artist who draws and paints mostly from life, for the most part, I think, so she's not necessarily creating a distinctive outline. It's a very hazy kind of almost like spider web of hatching that slowly turns into um, a fill-in of shading. It's a very it's a very uncertain way that she draws too, because you can tell she kind of doesn't know exactly, for instance, like where the edge is here, so she draws like multiple edges. It's probably because maybe the sitter is moving around, she's moving around, so there's lots of sort of like doubt of exactly where things are. Same artist. So the thing that I like about what she's doing is that she's sort of creating this like almost like a scaffolding of horizontal and vertical lines. And I mean, I'm not 100% sure why she's doing this. I think to some degree she's checking things. Like she's, for instance, like she knows by drawing this plumb line here that the nipple perfectly lines up with the edge of the ear. She knows that, you know, things across the whole surface of the paper where things align, which is hard to get students to do, because students tend to like they tend to draw something over here and then they move on to something over here and then something over here and over here, and they don't look at how things are sort of in a relationship throughout the entire um, paper. And another thing to keep in mind is that she's using her eraser. Let me move to the next slide. So as she's building up shading, um, she's drawing subtractively. I call this subtractively because sometimes you can, you know, don't think of your eraser as just a tool to remove mistakes. Sometimes you use your eraser to draw with. There's plenty of times that I've filled in an area with more shading than it needed because I knew I was going to come back and pull out all the highlights with my eraser. So this is oh, I forget this guy's name, but he always does these bizarre drawings that are kind of oddly conceptual. Like, so he literally took a piece of paper, crumpled it up, and then uncrumpled it, and then shaded it in on one side to make it look like it was still folded. He probably ironed it back out. Um, so like I wonder where's the light coming from? If you sort of know how shadow and light works, it's like this plane looks like it's in shadow, light over here. If it's light over here and shadow over here, I'm assuming the light's coming from this direction. Another Antonio Lopez Garcia drawing. Um, and I like showing this drawing because it shows you how you really need to be sensitive to all the value shifts. A lot of times what I find students do is that when it comes time to shading, they pick one or two shadow values and one or two light values, and they only use those throughout the drawing. So if I can go back real quick, I don't want to give you whiplash here. So what I find students do is they'll pick like one value, maybe two values of the shadow, and then maybe one or two values of light, and that's all they'll use. They'll just, every time there's a light area, they'll use one or two of these, and whenever there's a shadow area, they'll use one or two of these, and then all these sort of in-betweens, they don't use them. So the thing that I find very interesting about this piece is that when the room that he's in is lightly lit, so everything in here doesn't have really deep shadows, but there's still a shadow. Like this frame is casting a shadow onto the curtain there, but it's a very light shadow. But all the shadows outside are much richer, and the contrast is much greater. So, like for instance, the shadow that's in the room, like this shadow is probably the same value as the light side of the tree over here. So it's like the range of lights and darks over here are much lower on the value scale, but then the shift in lights and darks in the room is much higher on the value scale. So if you were to just pick one value for shadows and just use that for the room and the outside, it would look very flat. He's being very sensitive to all these shifts. And you can see, I just love how insane the detail is on this. And this is a drawing done from a photo reference. It's a flash photo. And flash photography is, I don't even know, do you guys even use flash photo? Do iPhones have flashes on them? I haven't paid attention to this. I don't tend to use my camera phone very often, but it's doing this very bizarre thing that's interesting. So everything that's closest to the camera is getting lit the brightest, and as you sort of recede further away, it's receiving less and less light. So it kind of creates space in this kind of gradient kind of way. Everything towards the camera is in light value, everything's further away is in dark value. So it's easy to kind of sort out the space. Further, dark means far, light means close. Same artist, he's taking photographs of like a projection. So the whole this is part of the drawing. This part that looks like it's the edge outside. Same artist. A different artist here, but like, and again, it's creating it's doing something very similar to the flash photography drawing, but in reverse. Here, it appears that what is closest to the viewer is dark, and as it sort of gets further away, it gets lighter, almost like the form is disappearing into fog. So it's doing the same thing, just in reverse. It's close is dark, far is light. It's doing an atmospheric perspective kind of a trick. Same thing again. Atmospheric perspective of sorts. Kind of looks like fog. Same artist, creating very delicate shifts in value. Like I like the way this shape here, it doesn't have any kind of outline. It's just a kind of a dissolve from one value to the other, which is tricky to do. Um, I think I'm going to do a technical demo where I show you how to smudge with graphite. Sometimes there's some people don't like smudging with graphite. Some people like smudging with graphite. Same artist. The shifts in the value are a lot more abrupt, sort of creating it's kind of making the water look a little more metallic. And this is all done from photography. There's no way you could draw this from life, like boiling water. It's just flickering form. You would have to do it from photography. Um, this one's kind of confusing. I like this drawing a lot. I think mainly because it's there's a lot that's going on where there's one thing to have to draw the chair. There's another thing to draw, light hitting it, especially if that light is like speckled light. It looks like it's light coming through a tree, so it's just all kinds of spots of light and dark. So it's not hitting the objects in a uniform way. So it's kind of creating this very abstract, like kind of lighting scenario. William A. Barry. These are all done in color pencil, which I don't think we're going to touch on color. No, we're not going to. This class does not involve color. Um, though, I mean, when it comes to your free drawing, feel free to experiment with color if you want. I'm not going to put a limitation on your free drawings. He's using color pencil, and he's doing it in a very similar to how a printer does it. He's using very limited colors and sort of letting the colors blend optically. He's not actually blending the colors. Same thing too. It's this really fine web of cross hatching of color. So he's literally using like a red and a blue, almost like a CMYK of a technique of a printer. And it's interesting to see how he has a grid on the background. It's probably done as a way of sorting out what he's seeing in life. It's a little easier to see the color mixturing here. Robert Bechtel. He's a Bay Area photorealist. I think he's still alive, maybe. I don't know. He always does these really intricate, detailed copies of photographs. They're kind of just like almost generic snapshots of his family, and he just copies them meticulously and usually in oil paint. I mean, these are some of his drawings I'm showing you, though. Meticulous attention to detail, and it's real easy to see that this paper that he's using has a pretty heavy grain to it, and it doesn't look like he's smudging it. It looks like it's all just layers of building up of graphite. It's hard to tell unless you actually see it in person how much they're smudging. And this is actually an old teacher of mine. His name's Tom LeDuc. This is graphite, believe it or not. It doesn't look like it. It looks like it's black, like it's charcoal. And he's using it on I think it's a paper. It's called Yupo paper. It's almost like this really smooth, almost feels like plastic. And since it's so smooth and plastic, like the graphite tends to stay on the surface more. Kind of almost looks like it tends to look darker for some reason when it sits on the surface. This is another one of his. This is actually a sculpture, and believe it or not, this is made out of graphite. It's a really confusing technique he used to just sculpt. If you were to tap on this, it'd be solid like a rock. I always kind of felt like these graphite sculptures that he made are almost like 3D drawings. It's meticulously manipulated graphite. It's just manipulated in 3D space. for now, let's end with this one, and I'm going to do another presentation that shows you technically how to manipulate and shade. So that'll be the next video.